Craft fan?
Oh, yes, I'm not talking. No one is recording this. All good. I didn't say
Oh,
anything. Don't worry.
oh, good. Okay, okay.
No, I didn't turn the mic on.
Okay. All right.
Here we
It's the
go.
beginning. Let's go. Yeah.
So I sort of reeled through historical materialism, subsumption, described subsumption. There's dialectic in subsumption, dialectical materialism. Subsumption is the process by which the social relations of production penetrate the labor process itself. Marx distinguishes between the formal and real subsumption of the labor process by capital. It contains in each moment of modes of production antagonisms, forces of production, relations of production, social relations of production, and feedback between the forces and relations. Now, in this particular article that we're continuing on, there is this idea of subsumption in terms of automation, where technology replaces technology, this idea that it progresses perhaps cyclically, and with that kind of framework, automation's accumulative conquest of more and more functions in the labor process is derived from the repeated that's each loop is a restaging of a real and, forgive the neologism, subsumption. Now, appropriate with this idea of accumulative conquest is also a disaccumulation. That's what this author, Wingard, is trying to introduce, and contrasting them is important because it you can see that it moves forward in time, but the the structure of that change is important. So you can see in this diagram here, postmodernity not yet towards a new periodization. And so periodization or periodizing seems on some people's minds anyway, and you can argue that on the humanist side or on the literary side for till the cows come home. But the reality, of course, is that there are in the final analysis or in the last instance, economic developments. And you can see here from 1500 to 2050 this description of what we could call the individual dynamics of modernity. So you see early modernity, high modernity, and late modernity. You can argue for some people that with the latest shift or the recent shifts, some people claim that there's a fourth industrial revolution that we're in now. I don't think the labeling matters. What matters, of course, is are these subsumption periods where the relation of labor to technology shifts. It does shift. I mean, we have, it's just historically there. We note, of course, and this is the problem in the analysis, is that people argue it from a particular point of view and don't account for the kind of unevenness that occurs. There are people still in this world who still are peasants, and or peasant-like, have a peasant-like economy, are um, treated like that in terms of their relation to agriculture. There are markets, but they appear quite more mercantile in some ways. So and you can say that in informal economies, which exist below the formal economy, that is, selling loose cigarettes in the street, for example, is you could say it's capitalist, but it's really a lot different than that. It's a just above barter in some ways. So, without going too far off into that handle there, you can see in this graph that there's a first and a second industrial revolution. You can see the rise of Taylorism and Fordism. Now, whether you argue after that moment whether there's post-Fordism and all that other stuff, you can note, of course, that even in a post-Fordist sense, there are still Fordist assembly lines somewhere on this planet. And it is thinking about that that's really important. That it is the North-South issue, is that there is still that imperial relation, and you can certainly see that in current politics, that um, imperial, whether making adding more gold doodads to the walls of your governance headquarters is more or less a replication of the prior mode of production. It's all very interesting, and you can see that as you go down this chart, there is a post-war boom, a long, what some refer to, and Robert Brenner is one of those historians who believes that there is a long downturn occurring, and this, of course, uh, tells us a little bit more about the swings in history that are not quite as clean as making a little diagram that says, the feudal moves to the capitalist, moves to socialism, et cetera, in a nice little even order. It's not happening that way. And you can see that 1973 was an important moment. 2008 was an important moment in terms of the long downturn that from one on, if you look on the right-hand side, you see ancients versus moderns, romanticism, and yes, in fact, Jane Austen notwithstanding, Romanticism was important during that period. That modernism is, part of a second industrial revolution, which gives us world wars, or at least what we might call world wars. Noting, of course, that we could be, with all due respect, currently in a third world war, because indeed, in the Second World War, you could be in parts of the planet where you didn't notice that a Second World War was really actually going on, aside from a few minor inconveniences. So, what counts as a global conflict was different up until nuclear warfare. The point, of course, if you want to use that same kind of periodizing, moving from early to high to late periodization, we are in late modernism, whatever that means. And it's hard to say, considering that modernity hasn't come to some folks already, if you assume uneven development. So this is the problem where declining rate of profit really describes not so much, but it still does, global north and south. The declining rate of profit is everywhere. It's in both places. It's not, and I think our current crisis in tariffs is a perfect example of this declining rate of profit, or at least a appearance of a crisis forward. So anyway, we've been looking at capitalism as a species of automation, Devin Wengert's article in Marxism and Sciences, and we started yesterday by rambling through this. I may skip ahead after doing a part of where we left off yesterday, um, only because this little part here gives us the front end, and then we can sort of skip to the conclusion, because the style of writing that Wingert introduces often you cross-reference yourself. You say, well, I did this in that section, so now since I've already proved that, we can move on to the next thing. So he kind of writes that way, which is interesting, cyclical even. And he's quite precise about that, thankfully. So where we left off yesterday, in sum, we can see that the crisis of the accumulation of fixed capital found in Marx's fragment, that is the fragment of machines, is transformed in capital, the text capital, according to the following logic. Number one, Marx's real subsumption describes a process through which the prospective crisis of fixed capital is sublimated by the introduction of relative surplus value, which reimagines technology as a vehicle for capitalist accumulation, as an asset, because it allows machinery to capture the relative value in the spread between different costs of production for commodities sold at the same price. Number two, if real subsumption thus reconceives the accumulation of fixed capital in terms of capitalist accumulation, the development of the technologies of the production process appears to embody the self-realizing development of capitalism itself, validating Pansieri's synthetic proposition linking capital's mode of existence and its technological development. Now, the point here, of course, let me break here for a second and say, underlying this, of course, is a certain degree of determinisms, whether economic or technical determinism. So try to ignore that as we move through this. Number three, reconceiving the technologies of the production process as assets that capture relative surplus value requires reconceiving labor as a differential magnitude that tends toward but does not reach zero. There's math here, but not much. Um, but this idea of reaching an infinitude or or approaching infinity, approaching zero at, is sort of an interesting problem, partially because that allows us to believe, assume, accept the idea of diminishing returns, et cetera, a certain set of ideas about uh, the kind of tendencies of what production does. Number four, its derivative status, and derivatives intentional there, its derivative status is now why labor time can be used as the measure of productivity gradients opened up by the replacement of technology by technology. Now, it's certainly, well, anyway. Number five, the differential relationship linking the replacement of labor by technology to the replacement of technology by technology thus sustains both a progressive logic in which capitalism is figured as a species of automation that realizes itself in automative technologies and an iterative logic which sees the recurrence of real subsumption as an absolute and mobile limit after which capitalism will, again and for the first time, finally have realized itself. So that's this idea of these cycles of subsumption. The distance between the crisis of fixed capital in Marx's fragment text and the concept of relative surplus value in capital thus both shows us why the threshold state of full automation cannot be a real state within capitalist development because it is an iterative series of states, and why it is repeatedly read as a state because it must be understood in relation to a limit that it displaces and recapitulates. So, just in terms of the logic of an uneven development, that's kind of what's going on. It's things that repeat themselves in order to, in order to live. While automation is bound up with the question of labor replacement, we can see now that the same subsumptive logic which incites us to think about automation as an explanatory mechanism behind the disappearance of labor, tending to zero, is paradoxically the logic that renders an integral linear understanding of labor's eventual disappearance as an insufficient explanatory device to conceptualize the relationship between technological development and the historical development of capitalism. And let me break there for a second and, imagine that there were equal terms for the global north and the global south, and that they had achieved zero, you know, labor. That is, the disappearance of labor was important. Everyone could just sort of talk to their little robot and stuff would get done, or whatever. Back to the text. If Marx thus diffuses the crisis of fixed capital quantitatively in terms of its ratio to human labor, he does not overcome the contradiction on which it is based. Instead, he reformulates it as a temporal contradiction animating automation itself. Marx's sublimation of the crisis of fixed capital retains the synthetic proposition understanding what automative operations actually do in the production process on the basis of the form of capital that they have historically come to embody, but does not understand that form as unfolding within a lateral, linear mode of time. Now, we talked before about the general intellect and other things, and I may actually skip sections 3 and 4 to get us to section 5 and 6, because then I can end on time. On the one hand, on the other hand, there's a lot to be read here, and it can move in a variety of directions, and it's not unproblematic. And you should go back and reread this because they explain the two diagrams I began with, the idea of the anachronism of the realer subsumption. It's anachronistic because it doesn't conclude, right? It just keeps going and moving. It progressively automation's accumulative conquest of more and more functions in the labor process is derived from the repeated restaging of a real-er subsumption. Apologies for the real-er. So, it is the logic that is more important. And then, of course, there's section 4, the epoch after, a symmetrical dynamic of accumulation and disaccumulation. Now, this is you have to assume, and this is important, if there is a presence of accumulation, there is something being, and particularly in the mode of production called capitalism, disaccumulation going on at the same time. And this is not the missing element. It is what Marx defers to the books, volumes 2 and 3 in volume 1 of Capital, that I'm going to explain more of this later, sort of kicking the can down the road. But the idea is, of course, that, and this is the opening for those who want to talk about, for example, finance capital. So, um, and so I managed to skip a section without, you can go back and read it yourself. In 2, Crisis and Chronology, I showed that how technological development came to be defined as capitalism's mode of existence through the way in which Marx sublimated the crisis of the accumulation of machinery by understanding it as a vehicle for capitalist accumulation. In 3, the real subsumption, we saw that once the accumulative dynamic of capitalism is understood according to the accumulation of automative technologies, that is, once you get machines, to that do more work um, by themselves, once the question of the replacement of labor by technology is systematically attached to, but made secondary to the question of the replacement of technology by technology. These periodizations of real subsumption iteratively disinter and contemporize the same epoch to describe the repeated and further subsumption of human labor. In the cyclist, that spiral that we saw there, the cyclist or cyclicist, the cyclicist archive, the story of capitalist development is thus both self-realizing and accumulative, the intuitive proposition this article began with, but only because it is anachronistic. The counterintuitive proposition I have been elaborating thus far. My next section, Wingert's next section, my next section introduces the secularist attempt to critique the mechanism I have called the real-er subsumption. Here I show that the secularists, remember he's contrasting the cyclicist and the secularists, here I show that the secularists attempt to overcome this legacy attending Marx's sublimation of the crisis of fixed capital accumulation. I first follow the reperiodizing gesture of the secularists as it disarticulates the identification of real subsumption, relative surplus value, and automative technologies. The secularists argue that we are living in a time after real subsumption because we're living in a time of capitalism's descendancy. Do they thereby also decentralize the explanatory privileges that the cyclics the cyclists give to automotive technologies? Is technological development not, in fact, capitalism's mode of existence, but only a conjunctural period whose connections cease to define capitalism today? The secularists base their critique on the fact that a symmetrical dynamic animates capitalism in its ascendancy and its descendancy, a claim that capitalism fails today in working as it always has. I think we can see that today. To that end, I focus here on the dynamics of accumulation in the phase of capitalism's ascendancy, before turning in my subsequent sections to the dynamics of disaccumulation that the secularists use to describe capitalism's descendancy. In this section, I show how the interpretation of real subsumption as a stage in an accumulative past of capitalism actually further centralizes the place of automative technologies as an explanatory optic on the temporal logic of capitalist accumulation. There's a parallel impetus to uniting how the cyclicists misread real subsumption and how the secularists correct the iterativity of this reading, namely, the critical burden of talking about how contemporary capitalism defines an epochal difference without, because of that same difference, ceasing to define capitalism as the present mode of production. And I've mentioned this gap before as one of kinds of, that describes the motion of capitalism itself as a system of expectations or expected value in that sense. inasmuch as their corrective is based on an operation that places real subsumption in the past by re-periodizing the present. The secularist account of capitalist development entails a methodological commitment to a twofold proposition. A claim about the difference that contemporary capitalism makes while still remaining capitalism is the verso of a historiographical claim about the secular development of capitalists up until that point. The secularists must thus treat two problems. Number one, if capitalism fails today, how does it remain capitalism? Number two, if capitalism works as it always has today, why is this period distinct from real subsumption? Put differently, in committing to a twofold proposition that defines the contemporary moment as an epochal difference within the span of capitalist development, the secularists attempt to avoid both the argument that the contemporary epoch is distinguished from real subsumption because it's no longer an epoch of capitalism, and the argument that in remaining within capitalism, the contemporary moment is not an epoch distinct from real subsumption. I know that sounds circular, has a certain circular logic to it, but the point of this is to try and show that that there's certain limits to the issue of machines replacing machines and machines replacing people. But anyway, here we have that diagram, which I described before, Nathan Brown's diagram that Wingert is using. Brown's article, Modernity Not Yet Towards a New Periodization, exemplifies the methodological commitment that we can only grasp the history of modernity through the moving contradiction of capitalist accumulation if we are willing to think that the structural determinations of that history through to the end of capital's tumultuous dynamics, rather than canceling the history of modernity as it moves into a late phase characterized by the achievement of real subsumption, which is a phase that we must note Marx had already predicted within the same historical conjuncture in which he identified modernity with capitalism, and that's a common identification. That is, industrial capital is the only capital in some ways to Marx. Now, eventually he changes that, but at least at the front end, and as you've seen, hopefully, in Capital, that's kind of the implication of that. The consequences of real subsumption are as much a part of modernity as the process of real subsumption itself, precisely because both result from and inhere within the history of capitalism. Brown's first proposition is that we must understand the contemporary moment as belonging to an arc within the history of capitalism and its secular development. Brown then proceeds with a second proposition that periodizes the present in the time after of real subsumption. The contemporary period results in the inception of the long downturn, a period that, according to Brown, will itself terminate in another epoch, in which he follows Gopal Balakrishnan in naming the stationary state. Such a state would ostensibly signal the end of capital's tumultuous dynamics. Now, here I'm not attempting to manufacture a consensus about the exact contour or contents of the epochs that the secularists place after real subsumption. After all, we don't have, we can't predict the future in that way. Rather, what Wingert would like to emphasize is a point of convergence among these efforts of reperiodization, that is, the long downturn, the stationary state, stagnation, and so forth, negotiate the difference that contemporary capitalism makes in remaining capitalism through an account of how capitalism fails to produce profit by functioning as it always has. Thus, if each secularist grants explanatory priority to the secular movement of capitalist accumulation in order to periodize real subsumption in the past, what they are required to explain is how that dynamic of accumulation becomes a structural dynamic of disaccumulation. So this is a new way of thinking about it, that, if there's going to be credit, there's going to be debt, right? Debts and credits are part of this whole thing. In other words, what aligns secularists like Benanov, Brown, Balakrishnan, as well as Michel Aguilera and Robert Brenner is a thin synthesis of the double proposition. Capitalism remains capitalism, thus fulfilling Proposition 1, because the same mechanisms which produced profit in its ascendancy, that is, let's say from 1970 onward, failed to produce profit precisely by continuing to work as they always have, thus fulfilling Proposition 2. This allows Brown to reperiodize real subsumption as a definite event or definitive event. This allows Brown to reperiodize real subsumption as a definitive event within the global history of capitalism that is essentially accomplished in the 1960s. Thus, if Brown is correct, he proves that, contra the iterativity of the realer subsumption, any account which mobilizes real subsumption to describe an epoch occurring after 1970 is essentially confusing cyclical phenomena for secular noumena. And yes, go to your Kant and figure that out. Benanov follows the same choreography as Brown, but as I've noted before, above, takes aim at automation specifically. Benanov argues that automation discourse is only the cyclical cultural uptake of a present period of stagnation, defined here as a combination of overproduction and underemployment which occurs in the time after real subsumption, CAI. He explains the conflation of automation and overproduction through an analysis of what happens when productivity increases outpace demand for output. According to him, introducing more efficient machinery into our production process will necessarily displace labor if a firm cannot simultaneously increase the output of that same process, as logically less labor will be required to reproduce the status quo output. See electric cars. Consequently, the recurring notion that automative technologies are directly responsible for replacing human jobs is only a symptom of a more primary secular process whereby increases in productivity are not balanced by equivalent or greater increases in demand for output. Not everybody's buying those electric cars. Benanov thus shows us why there is no necessary polarity in the correlation between the adoption of automative technologies and the replacement of labor. If the rate of output grows at a pace equivalent or faster than the rate of productivity, either no labor replacement will occur or employment will actually grow. Conversely, in a period of capitalism defined by stagnation, a period where demand cannot keep up with productivity increases, the surplus laboring populations thrown off by this process are then absorbed into various forms of underemployment, work that does not maintain and reproduce the worker. In number 1, Enduring Automation, I noted that these propositions are potentially an indirect critique of my own methodological commitment, which tracks the iterativity of real subsumption as an index of the temporal logic linking automation to capitalism. I said that Marx's introduction of the concept of relative surplus value is precisely what makes it possible to constantly restage real subsumption as an epoch, and as the auxiliary of this possibility, to constantly restage labor's disappearance. In interpreting this legacy, Brown's reperiodizing gesture severs precisely that connection by arguing both that real subsumption is a phase that can and has been accomplished, but likewise that the extraction of relative surplus value is a dynamic which can and does continue after real subsumption. Now, does this imply that automation is understood as a temporal problem only when real subsumption and relative surplus value extraction are mistakenly interpreted as synonyms, thereby erroneously understanding relative surplus value extraction as an epoch rather than a dynamic? This would mean that what I understand as a temporal dynamic proper to automation is merely a historiographical tendency proper to readers who likewise fail to discriminate between the epoch of real subsumption and the dynamic of relative surplus value extraction. Indeed, that is precisely Benanov's point in describing these collective readings as automation discourse. Because the usage of real subsumption discussed in my previous section would index only the cultural uptake of a given moment's historical conditions without accurately stating those conditions, such commentary would become exemplary, cyclical, and interchangeable. To that end, recourse to the concept of real subsumption outside of these historical bounds is simply inaccurate historiographical work. A theoretical problem with the usage of the concept, not a temporal problem proper to capitalist development. I explicitly formalized this tacit critique against my own argument as an opportunity to show the stakes of my claim across the subsequent sections of this piece. The secularists do overcome the realer subsumption, but they do not overcome its iterativity. If Brown is able to mobilize the continuation of relative surplus value extraction in order to demonstrate that we've moved beyond real subsumption but remain within the historical span of capitalism, I will show how my own formulation of that dynamic, the replacement of technology by technology, becomes a symmetrical mechanism that describes capitalism in its descendancy. My argument, therefore, adopts the periodization of the secularists, but emphasizes that this periodization, early, high, late, etc., retains the temporal problem first indexed by the realer subsumption. It retains this problem because the replacement of technology by technology still animates the logic through which capitalist development is periodized after real subsumption. In the subsequent sections of this piece, I will thus argue that the anachronism proper to automation is itself what lets us move beyond the historiographical anachronism animating real subsumption's reiteration. The endurance of this anachronism in the time after real subsumption repeatedly stages the disappearance of labor today as an avatar of capitalist disaccumulation rather than accumulation. While Brown and Benanov differently name and hold different ideas of how capitalism ceases to produce value in working as it always has, they make isomorphic arguments about the status of the contemporary moment as a period operating in the time after real subsumption and a period failing to produce value in operating as it has historically. And they both use isomorphic periodizations until they arrive at the moment which essentially locate the accomplishment of real subsumption in the 1960s, based as they are on Robert Brenner's book, The Economics of Global Turbulence. What we might call the secularist same difference approach, the same only different approach, has thus elegantly links the current period of capitalism to its historical development. But it is able to do so because it centralizes the symmetry of the mechanism through which past capitalism produced and accumulated value and through which present capitalism fails to produce and accumulate value. What then is this mechanism of accumulation that during the 1970s becomes a mechanism of disaccumulation? Now, we have already seen how Marx used the concept of relative surplus value to transform the accumulation of automotive technologies into a dynamic of capitalist accumulation, the fragment of machines. And later, how this transformed real subsumption into an epoch that was both accumulative and anachronistic. What happens when, conversely, that same dynamic of capitalist accumulation is used to periodize a time after real subsumption and thus used as an attempt to overcome the iterativity of that concept? Now, to answer this question, it's necessary for me to outline a single principle which would connect the following relationships. So this is important. What is it about capitalist accumulation in its specificity that permits temporality to become a primary register of its dynamics? And number two, why the dynamics of capitalist accumulation seem to play out across a particular order of time. Number three, and why the technologies of the production process come to structure the temporal order of capitalist development. Now, to understand these relationships, we must understand the role of automotive technologies in transubstantiating the capture of profit into a dynamic of accumulation. Now, as we've seen, capitalism produces surplus by leveraging the distinction between how much value an hourly wage can purchase and how much value an hour of labor time produces. This implies leveraging a systematic connection and a systemic difference between, number one, the moment of exchange, where the worker's labor power over a given quantity of time is exchanged for the wage, and number two, the moment of production, where that labor power is employed. Thus, Marx's insistence that the real contradiction animating capitalism is predicated on the relation between production and exchange, Department 1 and Department 2, rather than being located in one sphere or the other. Profit describes the unprecedented value produced during the time after exchange. produced, in other words, when the worker works past the time necessary to maintain and reproduce the subject. This unprecedented value is no less eminently exchangeable, and indeed must be exchanged to be realized. Surplus value is unprecedented value that will have had an equivalent. The real contradiction between capitalist exchange and production is thus that capitalism is a system of equivalence and commensuration whose mode of existence is defined by the production of equivalence violating surplus. This means that if it is to be realized, the surplus produced must find commensuration in a future production process and thus displace the internal limit of its past equilibrium. Now, the distinction between how much value an hourly wage can purchase and how much value an hour of labor time produces is thus the distinction between an actual quantity, that is a wage, and a virtual quantity, how much value a unit of labor time can produce after it will have been realized in the future. That expectations again, remember. In the capitalist mode of production, the arbitrage opportunity that exists between what value the wage can purchase and the value a unit of labor time can create is perpetually held open through a temporal distinction between what we currently have, that is exchange, and what the future owes us in terms of production. This is why temporality becomes a primary register on which the contradiction animating accumulation plays out. What we can already see is that inasmuch as the production process is a valorization process, inasmuch as it produces surplus, its temporal logic necessitates that it already has an accumulative dynamic, not that it is afterwards subject to a distinct or separate accumulative dynamic. Surplus value does not become actual value until it enters into exchange again. That's why it can have these variations of paid, unpaid, etc. For Marx, the story of capitalism's accumulative ascendancy is the story of how this futural orientation of the production process links the reproduction of already created value to the creation of new or unprecedented value that would have already been given an equivalent in a later production process. The technologies of the production process are a privileged point of passage between the virtual and the actual, because they link the actualization of the unprecedented value that capitalism has produced with the virtualization of the already extant value which it reproduces, CAI. My introduction of these temporal terms certainly does not cohere with the terminology that Marx himself offers, but I will demonstrate why it does cohere with his logic. For Marx, the storage of present value cannot explain capitalist accumulation. The phenomenon of removing capital from circulation, what he calls hoarding, is literally counterproductive. So how can we understand the accumulation of past value if it's not removed from circulation? If accumulation is instead predicated on the utilization of present value in a future-oriented production process, then the problem of what I am calling its virtualization emerges. That is, if one can only preserve already created value by consuming and reproducing it in a future production process, how could this magnitude be understood as having a value now rather than later, and thus potentially not at all? Because Marx does not understand already created value to be accumulated through storage, but rather through its consumption and reproduction. The dynamics of capitalist accumulation play out across an order of time particular to it. This is the contradictions of hoarding. In answering how already created value, virtualized in the production process, can have an actual value now rather than later, Marx emphasized the double status of the technologies of the production process. On the one hand, these technologies can be sold, albeit likely for a loss, to satisfy the discipline of payments now. On the other hand, machinery can be actively consumed or used in the production process. This incremental consumption of machinery, that is, its incremental destruction, fractionally reproduces the value outlaid on it, plus the relative surplus value captured by existing productivity gradients later. Since Marx understands the production process to be a reproduction process, machinery has a privileged place in the dynamics of accumulation because it doubles as an actual value now and a futural claim on a virtual value. Thought across many cycles of the production process, the surplus created then is realized through exchange of machinery which has an actual value now and which will, through leveraging productivity gradients, throw off a greater amount of value later, then realized in machinery, repeating the series. This futural mechanism of accumulation is thus properly ecstatic. It proceeds through itself to go outside of itself. The technologies of the production process are thus temporal loci, locus, loci, loci, which, in holding the past, present, and future of capitalism together, ensure that its productive mechanism is a reproductive mechanism, and thus coupled a dynamic of accumulation. The replacement of technology by technology secures the secularist double proposition in the period of capitalist ascendancy, why we can think of primitive accumulation, formal subsumption, and real subsumption as phases distinct from each other but not distinct from capitalism. There's a very good reason to mobilize the technologies of the production process as optics on capitalist dynamic of accumulation, a gesture that is compatible with the secularist periodization up to and including the point of real subsumption, inasmuch as the secularists use the dynamics of capitalist accumulation to periodize an arc of capitalist descendancy in which those same dynamics become mechanisms for disaccumulation. It is clear that this latter story must also include the automotive technologies of the production process. Number 5, angels of devalorization, the automation of disaccumulation. So, Devon in number 2, Crisis and Chronology, he showed how Marx sublimated the crisis of the accumulation of automotive technologies by introducing the concept of relative surplus value. Marx's concept effectively transformed these technologies into vehicles for capitalist accumulation by demonstrating how value could be extracted from the spread between productivity gradients, which specify different costs of production for a commodity sold at the same price. This assumes that there are obviously different firms. I then argued that this reformulated the stakes of automation. Relative surplus value extraction rendered the process of the replacement of labor by technology secondary to the process through which technology is replaced by technology. And number 3, the real subsumption. I showed how this legacy likewise reformulated the quantitative problem of the ratio between human labor and machinery as a temporal problem. The iterative occurrence of full automation posited capitalism as a species of automation that realized itself in automotive technologies. If the technologies of the production process are vehicles of accumulation that attend the historical development of capitalism in its ascendancy, can the process through which technology is replaced by technology also be used to periodize an epoch after real subsumption? Can the replacement of technology by technology also be understood as a self-realizing dynamic of disaccumulation and thus fulfill the symmetric requirement entailed by the secularist double proposition? In the diagram I reproduced earlier, Brown calls the period following real subsumption the long downturn and notes that it is characterized by a tendency toward a declining rate of profit. I've said that the point of convergence among the secularists is not a critique of automation specifically, but a historiographical gesture which derives the time after real subsumption through recourse to the fact that today capitalism fails to produce profit in working as it always has. A series of distinctions must be introduced here if we're going to transform that empirical fact into a secular dynamic and accordingly formulate disaccumulation as a concept. First, is this failure extrinsic or intrinsic? An extrinsic failure would describe a barrier to capitalist development that affects but is not engendered by its secular dynamics. This conception would propose that capitalism remains an accumulative mechanism which today is truncated by the inertia of external forces. Darn those voting people. I emphasized the symmetry of the secularist argument in my last section to demonstrate that the declining rate of profit cannot be understood in a classical sense. Understood extrinsically, what would periodize the difference that the contemporary moment makes to capitalist development would precisely be something other than the secular dynamics of capitalism. The secularists thus commit to an understanding of disaccumulation that is intrinsic. If the mechanism of accumulation becomes a mechanism of disaccumulation, accumulation, it is because it must actively produce a declining rate of profit. It's a little circular. This criterion also requires a set of distinctions that will shed light on an ambivalence in the secularist convergence around capitalism's tendential failure to produce profit in the contemporary moment. For example, when Benanov identifies the contemporary period with an intrinsic tendency towards stagnation, see today, this could mean two things. Stagnation could be a counterfactual proposition about the production of value, which says that more profit could have been produced than was produced, were it not for certain factors internal to capitalist development today. Conversely, to the extent that Benanov uses stagnation to describe not only the hypothetical profit that could have been captured would capitalism have been otherwise but a real loss, that tendency aligns him with secularists such as Brenner and Aglietta, for whom the declining rate of profit is also based on a proposition about the failed reproduction of already created value. In this section, I will demonstrate that the replacement of technology by technology becomes a dynamic of disaccumulation and thus a symmetrical means for periodizing the time after real subsumption, because it understands the declining rate of profit is a problem with how capitalism's productive mechanism functions as a reproductive mechanism. The replacement of technology by technology describes how capitalism becomes a species of automation that disaccumulates itself in and through automative technologies. I thus use disaccumulation to formalize the profit through which the declining rate of profit plays out between reproduction and production. And the time after real subsumption, automation shows us how the failure to reproduce past value becomes an internally produced limit on the scope of future value. Understanding the declining rate of profit as the product of an internal dynamic requires an explanation based on production and the desire for profit, rather than reversion to an explanation which understands the declining rate of profit according to increased costs of production. For Brenner, these internal vicious cycles are empirical products of the replacement of technology by technology in the period after real subsumption. I shall present an account of the long downturn, which finds the source of the profitability decline, schematically speaking, in the tendency of producers to develop the productive forces without regard for existing investments and the requirements for realization, with the result that aggregate profitability is squeezed by reduced prices in the face of downwardly inflexible costs, see tariffs. I shall explain the perpetuation of the crisis by demonstrating that the profit-maximizing steps capitalists find it rational to take in response to the reduction in their profitability not only fail to resolve the problem that brought down profitability in the first place, but have the effect in the aggregate of making necessary and rational additional responses which further undercut aggregate profitability. Now, you could see that maybe flexible production and globalization are part of that. Now, where relative surplus value allowed for the capture of the value thrown off by the spread between different costs of production of a commodity sold for the same price, Brenner demonstrates what happens when intra-capitalist competition forces the entire industrial line to recalibrate their expected profits based on the introduction of a more efficient technology, widening the spread, and ultimately converge on a lower commodity price, rather than merely replacing at the established price the output hitherto but no longer produced by higher cost firms, which has used up some of its means of production. Real world cost cutting firms, by virtue of their reduced costs, will reduce the price of their output and expand their output and market share at the expense of the higher cost competitors, while still maintaining for themselves the established rate of profit. You can see this in some predatory pricing. At the sectoral level, Brenner outlines three rational profit maximizing responses to the introduction of cost-cutting technology. Number one, the established capitalists can scrap their existing technologies and adopt those of the cost cutter. Number two, the established capitalists can choose to keep their current technologies, write them off as sunk value, and profit only from the capital they have in circulation. And number three, the established capitalists can leave the industrial line entirely, because in each of these scenarios, only the cost-cutting firm can produce the given commodity at a new lower price while maintaining the prior rate of profit, which higher cost producers would enjoy only before the price of the commodity was lowered. The outcome is an aggregate reduction of the rate of profit in the line that is not offset by the gains of the cost cutter. This sectoral internal limit on future process will iteratively intensify when rational profit maximizing competition initiates the cost-cutting replacement of technology by technology once more. If the replacement of technology by technology secures capitalism's secular ascendance, it does not function otherwise in Brenner's account of the long downturn in the time after real subsumption. His account of the long downturn through the lowering of the average rate of profit is an account of capitalism functioning rationally, capitalism functioning as it always has in its ascendancy. The accumulative dynamic animating the replacement of technology by technology can thus actively produce intrinsic limits to and downward pressure on the rate of profit. Conceived this way, stagnation would describe intrinsic limits to future growth. However, establishing that the dynamic of accumulation can produce limits which does not establish it as a dynamic that fails to reproduce already created value. What Brenner's argument narrates from the point of view of the production of new value can also be understood according to changing sectoral expectations about whether its current technologies will still be able to reproduce already created value. Scrapping existing machinery, treating it as sunk value, sunk costs, or abandoning the sector entirely all entail interruptions during which the production process does not reproduce already created value. Agiata notes that these potential interruptions are not violations of the logic of capitalism, but another valence of the same contradiction between exchange and production that always enabled it. Capitalist production is founded on the transformation of conditions of production whose origin is the creation of new means of production. But there's no reason why the pace of transformation of the productive forces should be adapted to the pace of replacement of fixed capital, which satisfies the conservation of the value of constant capital. We are faced here with a contradiction in the most rigorous sense of the term. This is a real contradiction in the process of accumulation, for which there does not exist any synthesis. On the one hand, as capitalism is a commodity-producing society, the reproduction of the conditions of production implies conservation of the value of all commodities in exchange. On the other hand, as capitalism is based on the antagonism of the wage relation, it cannot produce its constitutive relation except by revolutionizing the conditions of production. A contradiction of this kind cannot endure. One of its terms must necessarily destroy the other. It is thus the capitalist relation of production itself which causes the non-conservation of the value of fixed capital. There results a devalorization of capital. In number 4, the epoch after, we saw that the relationship between exchange and production was formalized as a real contradiction in which capitalism was figured as a system of equivalence whose mode of existence was defined by the production of equivalence violating surplus. The replacement of technology by technology became a dynamic of accumulation because it acted as a temporal locus for both the actualization of a virtual magnitude, that is, how much value a unit of labor time can produce after it will have been realized in the future, and the virtualization of an actual magnitude, that is, how the value we have now is preserved through its consumption and reproduction in a later production process. This dynamic thus specified the production process as a reproduction process. Agiata's complex intervention starts from the fact that because the reproduction of already created value is incremental, it must occur across many production processes. It is subject to a certain rhythm. Simply put, a certain amount of time and output over time is required for a newly installed technology to both recoup the capital outlaid on it and capture the relative surplus value of existing productivity gradients. This is the colloquial sense in which technology is understood as an investment vehicle, even when it is not directly financed. If the technology in question is not replaced during this time, and if the productivity gradients remain the same, then it will have facilitated the accumulation of capital through the reproduction of already created value and the production of new value. This is what Agiata refers to as the amortization of the technology in question. What Agiata argues is that through the dynamic of accumulation can be understood, although the dynamic of accumulation can be understood according to the replacement of technology by technology, there is no necessary reason why these processes should have the same rhythm. The replacement of extant technology by new technology before it has reproduced already created value is accordingly not an added cost of production, but a loss of value that should have, by definition, been conserved. This contradiction is what Ajeta refers to as the devalorization of the technology in question. Now, the very fact that the pace of the replacement of technology by technology can match the pace of the reproduction of already created value, thus becoming a dynamic of accumulation, is also why, when the replacement of technology by technology outpaces the reproduction of already created value, it becomes a dynamic of disaccumulation. The secularists maintain a same different strategy to the extent that the same temporal loci, the technologies of the production process, are themselves what enable a different temporal relationship between the actualization of newly created value and the virtualization of already created value, production, and reproduction. Past value, virtualized in the production process, is not actualized, that is, reproduced, by a future production process. What Ajeta calls non-conservation and what I am calling the failure to reproduce this already created value becomes a limit to the scope of virtual value that can be actualized or produced in the following production processes. Because of the symmetry of this mechanism, it would be more accurate to speak of disaccumulation as a pivot that indicates a shift in the modality of capitalist development rather than a shift towards a different system of production. We've now seen that the replacement of technology by technology is precisely what synthesizes the declining rate of profit, both as an internally produced limit to growth and an internally produced loss of an already created value. Now, how does this possibility secure its own repetition and compounding? Where the replacement of technology by technology posited capitalism as a species of automation that realizes itself in automative technologies, how does the replacement of technology by technology posit capitalism as a species of automation that devalorizes itself in automative technologies? Now, crucially, Ajeta argues that accumulation is only one of two polarities belonging to the same dynamic, but not that the accumulation of capital through the accumulation of automative technologies was only a conjunctural logic, which is now beginning to fracture. This is why the relationship between the development of capitalism and the development of technology is predicated on a real contradiction. In other words, we're not describing how a mechanism of accumulation that once held the past, present, and future of capitalist development together now begins to unravel. No, we're not. We are describing a mechanism of disaccumulation that holds the past, present, and future of capitalist development together. That it is not the dissolution of a conjuncture is what leads Ajeta to argue devalorization no longer expresses itself chiefly as a brutal interruption of the course of fixed capital depreciation. It forms part of the metamorphoses of value, and is integrated into the financial provisions for replacing fixed capital. This fund is lumped together with the amortization fund, from which it cannot really be distinguished. In my final section, I use disaccumulation to formalize the temporal logic through which the failure to reproduce already created value virtualized by the technologies of the production process, devalorization, becomes analytically indistinguishable from the incremental reproduction of already created value through the technologies of the production process, amortization. This distinction likewise indicates that disaccumulation is not the untethering of the production process from the reproduction process. What changes is the fact that disaccumulation now holds the moments of production and reproduction together. This is what it means to say, now quite literally, that a process of descendancy rather than ascendancy is what ensures that contemporary capitalism remains capitalism. Devalorization, if it's actually indistinguishable from amortization, it's not, must take place in the same productive reproductive process. Disaccumulation must therefore describes the way in which devalorization is produced in the production process and reproduced by the reproduction process. Consequently, there must be a real sense in which disaccumulation can be said to accumulate. Now, I asked this question of Gemini, just because it's an interesting question. Is devalorization indistinguishable from amortization? And Gemini comes back, and Gemini makes this argument primarily simply because there's a disciplinary difference between economics and accounting. And we've seen this elsewhere in terms of questions of value, among other things, and capital even. Um, and so acknowledging these differences, I think must be, I think Marxists need to sort of attend to this set of differences when making these larger arguments, particularly about big things. No, devalorization is not this. This is Gemini. No, devalorization is not indistinguishable from amortization. They're distinct concepts with different meanings and applications, primarily in the fields of economics and accounting. Here's a breakdown of their differences. Devalorization is to diminish the value, status, or importance of something. It's a broad term that can be applied to various contexts. And so it can be applied in economics to currency, official reduction in the exchange value of a country's currency relative to other currencies under a fixed exchange rate system. This is a deliberate policy decision by the government or central bank. The term devaluation is more commonly used in this context. Note, of course, that crypto is a player, is potentially a player in this problem, not now, but soon. And economics general assets, it can refer to a general decline in the market value of an asset due to economic factors, technological obsolescence, or changes in demand. But this usage is less formal than depreciation or impairment in accounting. So this formal and the less formal, I think, is what one needs to work through, because in fact, that's where Wingert's argument sort of well, let's say there's some questions. Amortization. Now, amortization defined in accounting is intangible assets, which intangible assets is something that is more important to, let's say, financialization, all those things we're looking at Michael Hudson about. In accounting, amortization is a systematic allocation of the cost of an intangible asset, like patents, copyrights, trademarks, goodwill, over its useful economic life. It's a way of recognizing the expense of using up these assets over time, similar to depreciation for tangible assets. Now, how similar is it to depreciation for tangible assets? That's a whole other set of questions. Accounting, debt. Amortization also refers to the process of paying off a debt, like a loan or mortgage, through regular installments over time. Each payment typically includes a portion towards the principal and a portion towards the interest. An amortization schedule details how these payments reduce the outstanding debt. And so I included from Gemini a table of the differences with two columns. First is the primary field. Secondly, the nature of value reduction. One is sudden, one is more gradual, whatever that means. But yet that reflects on Wingert's commentary on temporal elements. So I think you can sort of fudge it with that. Assets involved, it's only about currencies. Devalorization is only about currencies, and yet the distinction in amortization is between tangible and intangible assets in terms of debt principle. And intent mechanism is often external factors as opposed to internal or systemic processes of expense recognition or debt repayment. So there are subtleties here, mostly defined by time in some ways. Although there is a definitional difference, and I think that needs to be worked through, and Wingert has not done that. In essence, devalorization is about a loss or reduction in value. Amortization is a specific accounting method for recognizing the expense of using intangible assets or the process of repaying debt. Now, while both terms relate to a decrease in value or worth over time, which is the Wingert thing, the context, the assets involved, and the mechanisms are fundamentally different, making them not indistinguishable. So they are distinguishable. And so the last section here, which I will use, I will read it because this is the end, thank God. The only end, my friend. So let's try and get through this, and then if you have questions or comments, we certainly would appreciate having them. It's not that long, and this is the conclusion, which is the money, as it were, uh, and effectively summarize all the previous things, and sort of sublimates, as it were, the assumptions. Across crisis and number two, crisis and chronology, and number three, the real or subsumption, I argue that when Marx sublimated the perspective crisis of the accumulation of fixed capital in Grundrisse, he also rendered the problem of the replacement of labor by technology intrinsic, but secondary to the replacement of technology by technology. The consequences of this transformation meant that technological development became the accumulative mechanism behind capitalist development, its mode of existence intending towards real subsumption. In studying how this legacy was borne by Cyclicus, writing after Marx, I demonstrated that technological development was therefore simultaneously conceived as progressive and anachronistic, an iterative process through which labor was constantly staged in its disappearance as the obverse of the way in which capitalism realized itself in an iterative epoch of real subsumption again and for the first time. I try to imagine that, that assembly lines have changed. They do. In number four, the epoch after, I demonstrated how the secularists took aim at real subsumption in order to take aim at its iterativity, arguing that real subsumption is behind us, entailed that the secularists commit to a symmetrical proposition through which the mechanism of capitalist accumulation that did, eventually, accomplish real subsumption is also the mechanism behind disaccumulation in the time after real subsumption. And number five, angels of devalorization, I then showed how disaccumulation could only be conceived as a symmetrical mechanism to the extent that it could be thought according to the same temporal loci through which the technologies of the production process link production and reproduction. In my conclusion, I propose, this is Wingert, I propose that the secularists remain within the legacy of Marx's sublimation of the crisis of fixed capital accumulation between Grundrisse and capital, and I outline the consequences of that legacy today. I will first show that if disaccumulation now describes how automotive technologies link the production process to the reproduction process, then disaccumulation itself must itself be said to compound. In other words, if devalorization is a real contradiction, it is because it conceptualizes something than the simple dissolution of the mechanism that held together production and reproduction in the phase of capitalism's ascendancy. I will then argue that if disaccumulation does not decentralize the importance of automotive technologies as temporal loci connecting the reproduction of already created value to the production of new value, it is because it instead remaps their temporal logic. Externally, disaccumulation might be then viewed as an algorithm, which charts out capitalism's eventual end. We finally get to it. However, this will give us an inverted and incorrect view of its internal logic. So that's the cost. Internally, disaccumulation might also rather be understood as process that makes an indefinite claim on the future as the future of capitalism. So there's uncertainty here, ambiguity, indeterminacy, maybe. I conclude by reformulating an argument. Number three, the realer subsumption made in terms of capitalist ascendancy. Today, what automotive technologies are actually said to do is likewise derived from the anachronistic temporality of capitalist development that the replacement of technology by technology first enables. Automotive technologies become functional equivalents of human labor as an outcome of the process through which the replacement of technology by technology becomes a dynamic of disaccumulation. In restaging labor's repeated subsumption and disappearance today, full automation is the modality through which capitalism iteratively articulates its own indefinite dynamics of disaccumulation. And we saw that the secularists seem to revive a central concern of classical economics, that is, the declining rate of profit, but reinterpret it as an internal product of the dynamic of accumulation, which therefore becomes a dynamic of disaccumulation. Unlike its classical sense, here the declining rate of profit is due to a real contradiction in which the failure of the replacement of technology by technology to reproduce already created value is redoubled as downward pressure on the virtual scope of future value. However, failure is an unsatisfactory term here, as is devalorization, if it is taken to mean that only a quantity of value initially created is now lost. It is one thing to note that capitalism is based on an ultimately unsustainable contradiction, a system of equivalence and a principle of conservation coupled with a mechanism which violates equivalence by creating unprecedented value and a principle that commensurates this value in the future. Now, inasmuch as disaccumulation is now the foundation of an historiographical argument, its own implied terminus seems to radically limit it as a lasting metric for the future history of capitalism. Capital cannot, by definition, disaccumulate indefinitely, even though capital can, by definition, accumulate indefinitely. So, you need to think about what this equation looks like, what this fraction looks like. This fact is doubtless the hope of many of the secularists who periodize the time after Reel's assumption that here, on the threshold of capitalism's declension, might be a glimpse of what lays beyond it. Thus, Brown terminates on the stationary state, 2050, the year 2050, as a period ostensibly outside the bounds of capitalism. Does this render the dynamic of disaccumulation as a prophetic algorithm through which capitalism will eventually price itself out? We should see already that if the present epoch of capitalism seems to double as a proposition about the prospective end of capitalism, then from a temporal perspective, it has little in common with the sense in which we've used epoch in the phase of capitalist accumulation. Quite the opposite. The accumulative epochs that the current moment succeeds define themselves in terms of the limit they displace rather than engender. So that's the subtlety there, of course. Limits displaced rather than engendered. The real contradiction animating capitalism is not only that two contradictory logics exist in the same place at the same time, but they do so for the same reason. In accumulation, the real contradiction describes precisely why capitalism works. There's no preservation of equilibrium except through its violation. There's no conservation except through addition. See our tariff problem here currently. The energy of the contradiction itself is what magnetizes and associates its contradictory elements. It is if the declining rate of profit indicates how disaccumulation disassociates these two contradictory logics, then disaccumulation does not describe a real contradiction. Rather, it describes a contradiction that has already been resolved virtually. Thus conceived, this trajectory would follow the gradual uncoupling of reproduction and production precisely because they'd already lost their associating principle. The fact that we tend to imagine the declining rate of profit as an exceptional epoch that engenders its own anterior limit, a virtual trajectory that only needs to be followed to be actualized, is a sign that we are prioritizing the declining rate of profit as the causal mechanism behind disaccumulation, rather than understanding disaccumulation as the causal mechanism behind the declining rate of profit. While it may initially sound like a semantic distinction, I propose that the declining rate of profit should be considered as the outcome of a reorganization of the temporal relationship between production and reproduction, not as the causal mechanism behind disaccumulation. This shift would highlight how the real contradiction behind devalorization is not virtually resolved, but actually endures as a contradiction once devalorization is generalized in disaccumulation. As I noted in 4, the epoch after, the real contradiction associating exchange with production became a modality of accumulation because its temporal logic coupled the actualization of a virtual, unprecedented magnitude of newly created value with the virtualization of an actual magnitude, that is, the preservation of already created value through its consumption and reproduction in a later production process. Inasmuch as devalorization is another valence of the production process, the other being valorization, what is produced is an unprecedented magnitude that also violates the principle of equivalency in exchange. This is why Ajeta still articulates the real contradiction of devalorization as a violation of the principle of equivalency. Both the production of profit in an accumulative system, valorization, and the production of loss in a disaccumulative system, devalorization, violate this principle. We are therefore speaking of a form of, and this is an important idea anyway. Whether it works or not is another question. We are therefore speaking of a form of negative surplus, a magnitude that also appears as a supernumerary, unprecedented value that will need to be commensurated to be actualized in a future process of exchange. We have seen surplus violates the principle of equivalence by producing more than what was exchanged. Within the dynamic of accumulation, that surplus must be then given an equivalent in a later production process in order to be actualized. Negative surplus violates the principle of equivalence by producing less than what was exchanged. Within the dynamic of disaccumulation, that negative surplus must be given an equivalent in a later production process in order to be actualized. If negative surplus value appears as a declining rate of profit, it is because this magnitude understands its future equivalent as future reparations, as a reparative magnitude for the already created value that should have been conserved by right but was lost instead. In number 4, the epoch after surplus described what the future owed us. Negative surplus describes what we owe the future. Now, this is indeed the colloquial sense in which we are said to realize a loss. If devalorization compounds, thus becoming disaccumulative, it is because what it simultaneously reproduces is the loss of that already created value which should have been conserved. The dynamics of disaccumulation describe an abyssal modality of time in which the past, reproduction, and the future are drawn together. That's why I'm interested in catastrophe. As the actualization of a virtual loss, negative surplus value must be settled by a future equivalent, but definitionally cannot be without that settlement repeating and compounding the loss. It follows that when Ajeta says that amortization, the incremental reproduction of already created value through the technologies of the production process, and devalorization become genuinely indistinguishable, even though as above, we've seen that it's definitionally problematic. He is also describing the temporal reconfiguration of the relationship between reproduction and production. If, as he notes, the devalorization process allocates a magnitude of surplus for the reparation of past value not reproduced by that same process, then he describes the way in which, number 1, virtual surplus cannot be fully realized because it is already the debt of the past. And consequently, number 2, how this magnitude of unrealized surplus used to settle past debt will at the same time, at the same moment, be recapitulated as past debt that needs to be settled by another devalorization process. We posit an increasing magnitude of future surplus value as a virtual equivalent for the debt of the past, but we also posit that the future is the futurity of past debt, the fact that it will remain unpayable. See modern money theory. Understanding the declining rate of profit as a symptom of the rearrangement of the temporal dynamic proper to accumulation shows us why we should not imagine the declining rate of profit to represent a fixed limit and thus concrete endpoint to capitalist development. The declining rate of profit appears externally as a subtractive tendency towards an integral limit, that is, the number 0, that likewise puts a number on capitalism's future lifespan. Disaccumulation is internally a future-oriented process through which capitalism indefinitely displaces this same limit. Both profit, that is surplus, and debt, negative surplus, so negative surplus as debt, are claims on the future which claim the continuing futurity of capitalism. The indistinguishability of amortization and devalorization is thus the indistinguishability of a profit mechanism and a debt mechanism within the dynamics of disaccumulation. Disaccumulation describes the replacement of technology by technology within a temporal logic in which the past is already a canceled future. The future is an unredeemable past. As temporal terminals, the past and the future threaten to become reversible through a process whose causes are effects and whose effects are causes. Is this the kind of capitalist real-time that theorists of automation, such as May, imagined when he noted that we are on the disaccumulative precipice of automating the mental processes that can be made to control automated manual processes? Yeah, plug that Neuralink in. Capitalism thus appears as a species of automation today, not because it is self-propelling, but because disaccumulation is self-causing. If real time describes the modality of capitalism today, it is because the epoch after real subsumption is not only a different kind of epoch from primitive accumulation, formal subsumption, and real subsumption. The time after real subsumption is not, after all, epochal, it is abyssal. The cyclic cyst archive shows us how the replacement of technology by technology in a period of accumulation stages the repeated subsumption of labor, and thus constantly asks the question of its full automation. The secularist archive critiques the iterativity of this question by critiquing the iterativity of real subsumption, analyzing the role of the replacement of technology by technology in a dynamic of disaccumulation demonstrates that the secularists do not overcome this temporal problem in overcoming real subsumption. For his part, Benanov attempts to treat full automation today by distinguishing between technological properties that are labor saving, that is, non automotive, and labor replacing, that is, automotive technologies. If Benanov's goal is to understand how automation operates in a capitalist present defined by stagnation, he should not be able to maintain both of the following points. So there are 2 points here. Number one, any increase in the productivity of the production process that is not accompanied with an equivalent increase in output will reduce the number of workers employed in the production process. And number two, we can meaningfully distinguish labor augmenting and labor replacing technologies through an analysis of their technological properties. Now, if we could begin from the optic of technological properties and distinguish between labor saving and labor replacing technologies using such properties, then Benanov's economic argument would be moot. If Benanov's economic argument is not moot, it is because any technology that increases productivity without increasing output will become labor replacing. Accordingly, Benanov's account indexes an undecidable choice between a political economic theory of stagnation and a media philosophy of labor. If in his political economic theory of stagnation, technology is an economic modifier in which all increases in productivity translate more and more into job loss, in his media theory of labor, all technological development is consequently automotive development, and all technological operations are automotive operations. If Benanov attempts to displace and peripheralize automation discourse as an epical determinant through a political economic theory of disaccumulation, disaccumulation overcomes automation discourse only to rediscover automation everywhere. Whether a more effective hammer or a fully autonomous robot, all technology tends to be automotive technology under a dynamic of disaccumulation. It is, ironically, the time after real subsumption which fully synthesizes a media theory of automation and a political economic periodization of capitalism. The constant restaging of the question of full automation today, a problem of the replacement of labor by technology, is thus the restaging of capitalism's own disaccumulative dynamics. The replacement of technology by technology. This is why I've maintained throughout this article the initially counterintuitive proposition that automotive technologies are temporal registers on capital development. Reading across the cyclicists and secularists thus demonstrates how automation becomes a technological property in this first sense, a functional equivalent of human labor, because it is derived from a temporal dynamic structuring capitalism's mode of disaccumulation. Automotive technologies automotive technologies work now as automotive because they double as an exhausted cell for a reparative magnitude of value later. An economic paradigm in which any technology is an automotive technology is thus only the obverse of an automotive mode of disaccumulation in which capitalism moves by itself, which is to say that it operates in and as the absence of its own material supports. Echoing Marx, Benanov is therefore correct that striking workers misidentify automotive technologies as the primary threats to their livelihoods. Whew. Gee, they should have been just Luddites. Automotive technologies are forebears of a self-striking out a capital strike that has already happened. Okay, that's the end. Whether you got to an answer or not is a whole different question. And yes, I did go over time. Let me see if there are comments or queries. No, there are nice pictures. Ooh, interesting pictures of Nippon. Oh, so desu ne. I'm using up all my readability of Japanese. But anyway, how is there a third form of losing value, like how Tesla values are losing their value, not just because of amortization, but because of Elon? Yes, in fact, a kind of that's kind of an intangibility that is sort of built in there. Um, yes, but it is an asset, actually. You could say that reputational damage is an intangible asset. Let's put it that way. That's answering Anna's question. Amortization, my $50 pillow lost half its value the first time I slept on it. It loses another 1 cent every time I sleep. Devalorization, my $50 gift credit card I got December was then worth about 55 francs, but now it's only 40 francs. Yes, I should have spent it earlier. Indeed. Indeed. Not good, capitalists. Um, and It's a nice little room. Anyway, all right, I'm going to stop now because I went far over time. So I'm going to stop the live stream, and return us to our regularly scheduled activity.